welcome everybody to this webinar, which is reflecting on the State of Energy Research Conference, which was held back in February, but also probably trying to contextualise where we are today with some of the research. And so I'm very fortunate to be joined by my fellow panellists and committee members, Dani, Alexander, Paul, Medwell and Frank Jotzo, who really don't need any introduction, I don't think, in the energy landscape. But before we kickstart, I would like to pause for a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land of which the Curtin Institute is the Wadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and also obviously across Australia, because we are joined from every state, I think, and territory today. And I think we'll talk a little bit about First Nations, but it's fantastic to see the opportunities that are emerging through the transition. I think we really have to be mindful of how we do that. So for those of you that don't know much about Erica, I'm not going to spend too much time, but just it really is, it was started in 2018, I think, was the first conference that we had. We've managed to sort of get through COVID and those sorts of things. And each year the chair role changes to a different university to move across Australia. And I was fortunate to be chair for the last year. Dani Alexander will be picking up the baton going forward. But really, it's a combination of energy research institutes at different universities and really trying to bring the evidence base to the discussion and, provide research input where it's appropriate to policy and to industry and so forth. So I think really we're not going to spend a lot of time. I'm just going to actually hand over to each of the panelists to just share what were their sort of key takeaways from some of the things that you would have read in the communique, but also then if you could share how you think that, fits with the context of the landscape today, which has changed a lot in the last 4 months, somewhat depressingly. And then think about how, if we think about how we can accelerate the energy transition, it would be good to hear that. For people online, we will be using the Q&A function. So each of us will talk for about 5 to 10 minutes, at probably 5 minutes or so, and then we'll open up to Q&A. So I'm going to hand over, I think, first to Dani. Thank you.
Thank you, Peta. At the risk of starting on a negative note, I did want to start at the start of the communique that we had circulated in advance of this webinar. And really, this is a reflection on one of the opening talks at the State of Energy Research Conference that was delivered by Emeritus Professor Ken Baldwin. And Ken did a wonderful job explaining the situation that we are currently in Australia and the status of our R&D funding landscape. And really, it isn't a good story at this point when we compare our situation here in Australia with the situation that is happening with our partnering countries overseas. So the stats that Ken put forward really were stark. He noted that when you look at the proportion of GDP that Australia is investing in R&D funding, you're looking at approximately 1.6%. Now, it seems like that's large, but when you look at comparative countries, say in the OECD, the average, and that's by no means the highest level, is around 2.7%. So it's a large jump to get to that point. And in fact, I am mindful that the Albanese government has stated an ambitious goal of raising that proportion of GDP allocated to R&D to 3%. But again, we are still fairly far away from that goal. I am also mindful that since the conference, we have had some major funding announcement, but I expect if we were to do the calculations again, we would still be well below that average of the OECD and still plenty of room to progress towards that ambitious goal, again, that the government has set as 3% by 2030. And the reason why I wanted to start with this was actually not to be a Debbie Downer, but instead to really state the opportunity that exists now, given the alignment of this timing of 2030 for 3%, with the alignment of goals that we have and reflected on across the State of Energy Research Conference around the energy transition, but also the decarbonisation agenda as well. So it seems very timely to be discussing this, given that alignment and the opportunity that might exist in this year, but also the years going forward, to extend our R&D efforts towards those energy transition and decarbonisation goals. if I were to, I guess I wanted to also reflect on a panel session that I moderated at the event, which was focused on industry-led cooperative research centres, and link those two concepts together, because I think given the announcements around the future made in Australia, there is likely to be a huge opportunity to expand the work that we do in industry partnered research. And we looked at the cooperative research centre model, and we in fact had 5 separate CRCs on a panel, which was somewhat unwieldy because we had the industry partners, or one of the key industry partners, as well as the leader of that CRC. But in fact, it was one of the best panel sessions that I have been a part of. And so I was really pleased to moderate that. And I suppose I wanted to leave with a couple of reflections from that session in particular to potentially lead to thoughts of what we could do in the future, which was, first and foremost that, across all of these areas, a rising tide lifts all boats. So where there are opportunities where there is shared interest, we should amplify them so that we can draw more interest and support for the work that we do. It was quite clear through that panel discussion that there may be some different views on certain topics. So, for instance, we had a really interesting discussion about injecting hydrogen into gas networks, but I think there was still plenty of common ground that we could work towards, even if we are taking slightly different pathways. Some of the classic myths that existed were teased out a little bit, like the conflicting incentives that might happen between, say, a need to publish in academic journals versus this technology translation piece. But I feel like the people on that panel were able to I guess, rebut that as a standing myth, or some of the other myths that might exist out there about the challenges between industry and research collaboration, and really finding again that common ground, the opportunities to collaborate, and focusing on that and being able to extend that into the future was a really exciting session. I might just finish there. I could go on, Peta, but I think
that's all right.
5 minutes.
Thanks, Dani. Yeah, there's a lot to be talking about. Frank, I'm going to go to you next. Thank you. And it's perfect to hear from you right now. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks everyone for joining. And so obviously we've had an enormous success story in Australia regarding the energy transition so far, in terms of the uptake, the very fast uptake of renewable energy. And so despite this sort of ongoing debate about, whether the government's goal of 82% renewables at 2030 can be met and how that relates to the emissions target, fact is that the rate of uptake of renewables and that speed of the coal to clean energy transition in Australia has really been as fast as anywhere, and faster than in most places in the world, which of course, puts us at the forefront of experiencing some of these challenges and dealing with all sorts of things, technical aspects, regulatory aspects, policy aspects, right? And so looking to the future, what we see is an enormous challenge to bring much more investment into that switch to clean energy, as well as the switch to clean industrial production processes and structures. And that'll be measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars over perhaps just a decade, and then following on from there. And so where you need a lot of investment, you need to deal with the risk that affects that investment. And so, many sessions at the conference spoke on this. And, one aspect is, of course, the risk of future market returns. Market participants at this point need to form views as to future energy mix, future market settings, and regulatory settings as well. If you invested into a standalone renewable energy facility now, you would not have necessarily a very clear picture as to what will be your market-based returns for the energy that your asset will be generating in 2040, 2045, for example. And of course, we've got policy coming in. We used to have a renewable energy target, still exists, but largely not providing much revenue to new entrants. The dominant model now and in coming years will be an underwriting model through the capacity investment scheme. That'll probably work, right? And that'll be somewhat quite well insulated against future potential policy change as well. But big question still, what happens after 28, 29? What will be the mechanism to provide confidence for investors to put those hundreds of billions of dollars into those technologies. Now, in industry, of course, much wanted the Australia's comparative advantage potentially in very large scale production of industrial commodities on a renewable energy basis, including for export or especially for export. Much discussion really in our circles about green industry policy, right? So what are the opportunities? What are the things that governments should focus on in supporting that green industry shift, relying on renewable energy, and what to provide support for and how? And there's certainly different perspectives that are based not necessarily on fundamentally different understandings of the problem, but mostly, I think we found out at the conference, the different perspectives based on different groups placing different elements of emphasis on different aspects, different objectives, right? So do we focus on effectiveness or do we focus on efficiency of support for that green transition, for example? Do we focus on what we are quite sure will work and just gradually expand out from existing comparative advantage? So that would spell, support for green hydrogen as a base commodity to flow into other aspects of resource processing, or do we focus on more blue sky opportunities, the potential to establish deeper processing industries and even manufacturing industries around the green energy advantage in Australia. Overall, from this, one thing that came through very, very clearly at our conference was that massively increased need for understanding, right? And the important role for universities to actually help create that understanding right through governments and through industry and Australia's society overall. So university research and education has an important role to play, and really we can't overemphasize the need for a broader and more well-skilled workforce in this field. And part of that certainly is that we'll need many more university graduates who are well versed in energy transition issues.
Thanks, Frank. Jump over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So firstly, thank you everyone for hosting such an excellent conference. Peter, I think that's probably aimed at yourself and Eleanor, who did a lot of the work behind the scenes. So I just wanted to call out that as one of the highlights from the conference was how well it was organised. So I think throughout the conference, it was a great mix of different aspects, from the technical through to the regulatory, which is the one that I'll probably quickly touch on. So I think through the conference, we heard lots of technological advancements, and notwithstanding Frank's comments that we need more understanding and more knowledge, a lot of that technical work is happening, and we do have some of those technologies that are right on the cusp of being able to be rolled out. But one of the keynotes from Penny Crossley at University of Sydney, I'll quote her a line from one of her slides. So the biggest resistance to energy transition is the resistance to changing our regulatory models. And I think that's something which I've seen firsthand in many different levels, is the regulations as they stand are not fit for a rapid expansion of our energy systems. And whilst this is widely recognised, I think the regulatory systems that we have are moving too slowly. And so with all the great technology advancements that's happening, and we want to continue that moving forward, we need our regulations to catch up on that. And there's a whole host of regulations that need to be changed. And I think that was something which came up in a lot of the discussions at the conference, was getting regulators on board and how best to engage with them throughout this energy transition. So maybe it's from a technical perspective, as coming from an engineering background, it's easy to say, well, we have the technologies, why can't we implement them? But we need those regulatory frameworks to really enable that in a more cohesive fashion. And as I said, those regulations span a whole range of different topics. So we look at the regulations that the Australian Energy Market Commission have, through to the technical regulations that cover electrical, gas and water installations. And so they all need to be revised and modernised to enable this steep transition. Couple other comments I'll make, not necessarily just on regulations, but one of the challenging factors between that technical and the regulatory space is not knowing which technologies are going to be used. And I'll use hydrogen as an example here. It's often sold as the Swiss Army knife of decarbonisation. So just as a Swiss Army knife has the useless corkscrew, there's probably going to be some technologies of the energy transition which we think might be good on paper, but they don't turn out to be great. And so we need to make sure that our regulations and our researchers are aware that not everything is going to be known yet. And we don't know what things will kick off and which ones will be the corkscrew of the tool set. And so I think there's that interplay there between the technologies, recognizing that some are better than others. We just don't know which ones yet, and understanding how that would fit with the regulations. And then just a final comment, which I'll try and lead back to you, Peter, in a minute. I think one of the observations that I got from the conference was the even amongst the research community, sometimes the misalignment between energy markets and electricity markets. Sometimes they get confused and people only think of electricity in their energy mix. And so I think it's important to be understanding of decoupling energy and electricity, because mass electrification may not be the only tool to decarbonisation. Then the last one before I'll hand back to you, Peter. One of the things which did come up is I'll use the NIMBY acronym of no one wants it in their backyard. And there's that social aspect there which really needs to come into it. Final one. The last comment I'd just like to make is, as a community, one thing which I'm not sure was discussed at the conference, but maybe as a panel session we can touch on this later, is how well we as Erica and energy researchers do at communicating the need for the energy transition to the wider community. Again, we don't want to alarm the community as a whole, but when I speak to people outside of the research community, yes, they're broadly aware of the need for climate change, but the need to actually transition our energy markets, I'm not sure that we've necessarily escalated that to the communities as much as we should have. So anyway, there's just a few random assorted comments. I'll hand over to you, Peter.
Perfect segue. Thanks, Paul. I've been emphasising for a very long time that we should be doing a lot more in building that understanding. And I know there's been calls at all different levels of society about the need to build the narrative and to engage the public more broadly. I think it's really imperative. There's ways to do it, but at the moment it's always, even 10, 15 years ago when I was at CSIRO meeting with government, oh no, it's not our role, industry has to do it, meet with industry, well, we can't do it, we're not trusted. And so there is a need for momentum in that, I suppose, absolutely. So I guess just reflecting, we're really fortunate I think what's come through in many of the discussions at the conference, but also subsequently, and what plays out in media, is that at the heart of the transition is people. Whether it's the regions that are being asked to host all of the new infrastructure that we're thinking about, the size and scale, through to our First Nations and recognising their role as rights holders as we move through. It is, but also recognising that we're not a homogenous society. There are so many different parts, and I guess we're seeing that play out. So we were very fortunate to have Chris Soundness from the Wimmera come and share some of his first-hand Wimmera Southwest Development Development Authority. And Chris is really at the centre with his community, having to host transmission lines, look at renewable energy, and even some critical minerals mining as well. And I think, what he highlighted and what I take away is you need to build trust with these people, and be able to provide the information to answer the questions that they have, and they will be all different. And I think the big challenge with that is that to build trust, it takes time. Frank and I were recently at the Australian Energy Conference last week, and someone from ATCO presented the work that they'd done with First Nations in Canada. They had 3,000 meetings over a period of time to build a transmission line, which the First Nations people had part ownership in. So I don't think we can underpin the importance of trust, can't stress that enough. And there's a lot of social science theories that have been, tried and tested, but I still question why are we not getting it right. And there's some great work going on subsequently and continues to do, and we did see some of that showcased through the conference, but it's an area that I think needs a great deal of work, and potentially that narrative and understanding is actually part of the more broader communication. But communities are looking for benefits, and it's not always just about jobs, as Chris pointed out. When you've only got a small workforce, actually saying you're going to bring jobs means, well, you're going to take away our workers. So we've got to think about what are the benefits within the context of the communities that you're working. If it's First Nations in regional and remote, it might be actually making sure that they've got access to nice, clean energy as well, and water and all of those sorts of things. So I think we learnt a lot around thinking on that, but there's a lot of work to be done. And from the point of view of acknowledging the government's sponsoring the First Nations Clean Energy Network, and there's a lot of work being done by that body. So I don't want to talk on behalf of them, but I think it's really important. We were fortunate to have Dr. Kate George share some of her views and experience in this, and I think really highlighted the challenges of Australia as this vast country. And so, as we heard probably from you, Paul, as well, that it's not going to be one technological answer. It's got to be different for each case, because Kate pointed out, driving an EV in remote, the remote Pilbara in the back blocks of WA, it's probably not going to work. And those lithium batteries probably aren't going to exist in the heat temperatures that they get to. And so we've got to really think about a fit for purpose. But just to reflect on where are we now, and then I, will encourage anyone to use the Q&A function to put questions in. I think what we're seeing play out now is really not helpful, because, as you say, Paul, there's a lot of people within the Australian context that, when I've done focus groups or citizens panels, you talk about electricity, you talk about energy, and it's sort of the switch on the wall. And when we're at an AEMC event not so long ago, I think Paul Simshard said, for those sorts of individuals, it's everyone's job just to make sure it's easy. So not everyone wants to engage. And I think Anne Collier gave a really good example of the different people that were, her daughter's netball supporters at the conference last week, sort of showing the different ways that people want to interact with electricity and their energy bills more broadly. But what's not helpful, I think, is the vested interests of people trying to pick winners in some ways. And I think this is what's playing out. I hope this person doesn't mind. I'm not going to identify them, but I got a lovely email from someone in the investment side of things saying that, they're getting whiplash from turning, on every different part, which doesn't happen in other parts of infrastructure. And so I think there is something, as, Frank talked about, this idea of Erica and researchers providing the evidence base, but doing it in a neutral way that's going to sort of help people think about the trade-offs. Because the other thing that comes with the transition is the impacts on biodiversity. And we have to understand that there will be trade-offs with this. And so what does that mean as well? There are some questions coming in, but is there anything just sort of to reflect quickly, Frank, that you want to share at this stage?
No, should we move to questions?
Yeah, let's go to questions. Okay, so I'll read that. The first one comes from Peter Hansford, who was also on our committee. So thank you, Peter. Paul makes a good point about the need for an accessible narrative around the transition. We're in the midst of another round of climate wars. What is the role of universities and the education sector to equip the population with the knowledge and skills and navigate the energy transition? I mean, I touched on that, but who wants to jump in?
Well, seeing as my name's at the beginning, I probably should make a start. Look, absolutely, I think universities need to do more in terms of that outward facing. We as universities are very good at beating our chests at how good we are, but we're not necessarily raising, I was going to say raising concerns, but I know that my senior management don't like me talking about concerns, and I think that kind of goes to the very point. There's a lot of focus on universities to be positive, and I think we do need to be positive that there are solutions out there for the energy transition, but I do think we need to be a little bit more proactive in saying, well, what we're doing at the moment is probably not on the right track, and the trajectory is not looking exactly where we should be. So I think there is a role for universities to be a little bit more forward in saying that we do need to do more. Obviously, as with any university or any researcher, you do need to be mindful though that it's not just sounding like a beg for money, because that's, I think, getting that line between saying there is a problem and it will cost money, and yes, we will be the beneficiaries of that. I think we as universities do need to be more careful about that than perhaps some sectors, but I think we do need to be more proactive in that front. And I think the education piece is a big part of that as well. I think what we've seen anecdotally is students have an interest in energy, but not necessarily wanting to come and enroll in a course directly straight out of high school. And so I think where we get a lot more of our energy education requests is through people who have worked in industry for a while, and they realize, oh, hang on, there's a lot more about this that we need to learn about. So I think it comes back to that, educating not just our students, but the population more broadly of the need for more knowledge in the community around this area. Sorry.
Thanks, Paul. Dani, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I might add something just because I realized I started with a request for money at the beginning of the session. But I completely agree that we need to be mindful about how that's perceived. I think there is a really good case for an extension or an expansion of the support for R&D more broadly, and that includes innovation that exists outside universities as well. And the reason is that it leads to incredibly beneficial outcomes, so high societal impact. And I think from what I've seen of late is that universities are getting better at understanding, on one side, the societal impact that their work does, but also being able to communicate that as well better. What I would say is that that's a journey, and we've started that journey. Maybe we're a few steps along the way, but there's a long way to go before I feel like we're at a point where the community at large is able to understand the depth and the breadth of the societal impact that universities have. And I think that goes to the research, the technologies that come out of universities, but also I think, Peter, as you mentioned, the role in education. And I think we haven't had a chance to really go deep on the workforce piece here, but I know, Peter, you've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and it's a really, really important point given the extensive requirement of resources that the energy transition is going to take, and those resources not just being physical resources, but also the human resources.
Yeah. And just to close out, I mean, Peter Hansford and I've had lots of conversations. There are such good processes that can be used. And Paul, it's okay to talk about the challenges, because really it's the trade-offs, and actually getting people in the room, the Australian public at all different levels. They have an innate ability to understand this. There is absolutely no issue. If we look at regional Australia, many of them are on the tractors, listening to the radio, and really actually very well engaged. If we think farmers, they're good at managing risk. And so they're looking at, well, what are the opportunities and how can I benefit? But what we're seeing, I would say, it's not really NIMBY. It's about, people's social identity and their sense of place. So if they've lived in a place for a long time, which identifies as a strong agricultural, and suddenly we're actually asking them to shift, to think about, okay, you're going to be a solar farmer or a wind farmer. We have to respect that that's change, and that's tricky. No one likes change. So I think there's several levels when we think about bringing the public along. And just the mention of education, I'm seeing a lot of young students come through, engineers at all different levels, even people taking sort of more of the sort of arts and things, but about wanting to build sustainability, circular economy. So we are seeing it. I'm going to move to the next question, and I'll go to, oh, Frank, sorry, you've got your hand up. I'll do that, and then we'll go to the next question. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I'll be brief. I mean, Peter's question was specifically about the climate wars, and I would contend that if any major party in Australia chooses to weaponize a particular issue for political gain, then there's really nothing that the universities in the end can do to prevent that, right? Now, mainstreaming knowledge about climate change and energy transition in our education programs, I think, is really, really important, right? It's a good opportunity. And nevertheless, of course, we're only reaching the elite that way, right? And so I actually say a key function that the universities have and that they've been fulfilling really, quite well under the resource constraints that we've had is to provide research-based insights into the debate, including for the use and uptake by others, for example, by NGOs, by unions, by governments, in fact, right? Much of the understanding, for example, about how the green energy transition could unfold, right, really was created at the heart of matters by the universities a decade ago also, right? And so that's really, I think, the main function that we have there. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to go on to David Bain's comment. So as we speak, federal opposition leader is spruiking build sites for 7 nuclear reactors, including in my beloved city of Newcastle. Why do we in Australia continue to obfuscate with renewable generation technologies in the face of clear evidence to the contrary? Does this simply add to uncertain investment environment which hinders new generation development and climate progress? Frank, did you want to talk to that? Because it did come up, the whole investment uncertainty last week, didn't it? A lot. And also the nuclear conversation. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and of course the nuclear conversation comes up a lot in our circles as well, and did come up at the conference also. And look, I mean, views of course differ over desirability of specific technologies, including nuclear. I'll attempt a very short characterization of dominant views in this community as represented at our annual conference this year, right? And obviously, it'll be in the eye of the beholder, but I characterize it as something like this, right? Nuclear shouldn't be ruled out, obviously, anywhere, because, there is the zero emissions, net zero imperative really for the world. But with current technology, it would really be completely cost uncompetitive in Australia because the competition from renewable energy is just like, it's a lay down misere in favor of renewables plus storage in comparison with nuclear. On top of that, it would take a very, very long time because we haven't got the engineering or regulatory base for establishing a nuclear industry in Australia. And so, everything's kind of stacked against nuclear in Australia. And so the very obvious way forward is renewables. But, on the whole, I would say this community would not say that nuclear is something that shouldn't be touched. And it's certainly very cognizant of the fact that nuclear has an important role to play in many other places of the world.
I don't know if the others want to comment, but having worked on and seen the divisive nature of radioactive waste storage in Australia, which we haven't cracked, and I don't think many places in the world, I mean, even the US is reopening because the only place they can store it is Yucca Mountain, and they're not allowed to store it in Yucca Mountain. So I think when we look at the whole life cycle of technologies and things, there are challenges, and it is such a divisive technology as well, which I think is challenging. I don't know, Paul or Dani, is there anything you wanted to add to that around the nuclear conversation?
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of very quick ones, hopefully. So I think the first one, as Frank pointed out, we just don't have that workforce here. If we look at the amount of training that's needed for our submarines going to nuclear power, and in that case it's really just a set and forget technology, and you think of the number of training materials that are needed just for that very bespoke application. Putting it in a wide scale power electricity generation scheme just seems mind-boggling to me. The other comment I'll just quickly make is the energy transition is not just about carbon emissions. I think that it's very easy for both the community and us as researchers to go, well, we just need to eliminate carbon from the production. I think we need to think broader than that and look at all the other issues around other forms of waste that nuclear are going to generate. What other problems are we creating? Again, I'm not saying nuclear doesn't have a place, but I think rushing at it like a bull at a gate is not the right answer, would be probably my personal take.
And perhaps just to build on that, I just go back to David's question and just cover off on this, this point around obfuscating the renewable energy technologies and the risk that we have of delaying the rollout, which we're already experiencing to certain degrees due to other factors, say we talked a little bit about regulation and the time to connect. So I guess my concern with this debate that is happening is that there'll be another factor adding to the delay, and the risk is so high that if we wait, that we will just not meet our emissions reductions targets that are already extremely ambitious.
Yeah, and
So
just last week,
sorry.
just last week, Rick from the CEO or Australia VP for Energy talked about that Australia is actually the hardest place to roll out renewable energy at the moment. And I think it's around this regulatory uncertainty. And if I go back to, I can remember doing surveys when I was at CSIRO, public opinion surveys, when John Howard started talking about nuclear. That's here we go again back then. But what was interesting in our earlier surveys before that, it was 3-1 against, public opinion was for nuclear. When it started to appear, people shifted, went into the uncertain because obviously it's been talked about. So that's what we'll be seeing reflecting in the polls, because as we say, not a lot of people know much about it. And then if the politicians are talking, so I think we've also got to be mindful that people will report these results of polls and things, but they are just one snapshot at one moment in time. So Chris Soundless has asked a question here if we move on, and I will just get your, because Chris, it's the Wimmera Southern Mallee development. I apologise, I didn't cite that properly when I talked, but it's an insightful question here, or also a bit of a comment. In the early part of the 20th century, universities played a key role in delivering extension services in collaboration with place-based organisations to rural communities. It was all about getting communities to understand and adopt science to deliver better outcomes. Now it seems the universities don't have the connection to place-based organisations, and the communication is either in major centres with expectations to communities to travel to them, or communication spun to death by corporate specialists, which are missing the mark as they do not understand the communities involved. Who is, or how can we change this flaw? Should I start? I actually gave a presentation yesterday. I think it's really important, Chris, and I actually do think there is a lot of place-based research happening at different levels. It's probably not always reported, but even if I think about the work that Chris Briggs and the guys at UTS are doing out in the communities for New South Wales workforce, that's very much working with communities. One of my colleagues is just, or a couple of my colleagues at Curtin have spent a lot of time just working with a First Nations group to track their aspirations and so forth. And I presented yesterday to the Future of Work Institute, and they reflected that actually a lot of the work we're doing is with communities. So I think it is happening, but and I know, Chris, that you're connected in with Federation University, but perhaps it's actually thinking about how we do that at a grander scale, perhaps. But maybe, does anyone want to share some of the other work that they're doing and aware of within their universities at the regional community place-based level?
I'd be happy to quickly share something. And look,
yes,
I knew there's a few academics who engage with regional, in fact, local issues of the energy transition in terms of, community adjustment processes, in particular in areas where coal-fired power stations are closing, especially Hunter Valley, right? Increasingly central Queensland as well, right? Of great interest for us. But of course, our focus is the research in order to understand what lessons can be drawn from the events that unfold there, right? So our role as a university is fundamentally not to actually drive the broad-based community engagement or anything like that, right? And so that to that extent, it's really in collaboration with community organizations, right, where we can, for example, give the occasional seminar or assist the people who are working in community engagement in NGOs, for example. Heighten their knowledge base and that kind of thing. That would be my perspective and experience from AME.
Anyone else?
One addition that I wanted to make was just highlighting some research that's been done recently by Dr. Mike Roberts in the collaboration on energy and environmental markets that we have at the University of New South Wales. And I was just wanting to highlight this because this is about communities within broader communities. And he had done a piece of work for Solar Citizens looking at particularly groups that are living in apartments, renters, those who maybe don't have easy access to solar and are not getting those benefits, and had done an analysis to understand, what is the gap there? What's the benefit that we're missing out on for those communities within, say, even an urban community here close to UNSW? What could they be missing out on? And across Australia, the size of the prize, if you could tap into that, is $9.3 billion per annum. That's what people are missing out on because they don't have access to certain technologies. So I thought that was quite interesting. If we're talking about different groups within our communities and how they're getting access to the benefits of the energy transition.
Yeah. Paul, I might just add something and you might want to add, because I just got a little update here on the side also from Chris saying that also, like, he's actually interested in how it becomes embedded. The research findings become embedded to be part of that extension component. And do universities have a role in that change process? So that, Paul?
So my take on that is I think universities do have a role. I guess that's the short answer. I'm going to put on and do what I normally do and ask the questions, which I probably shouldn't. I think there's something embedded in Chris's message, which I think we are probably all guilty of. Universities are increasingly corporate structures, and it's all about a dollar value. And so I think there needs to be potentially a change in some of the financial models around the way universities work, of not always chasing the dollar, because a lot of these, and I'm not in any way saying it's not important, but that social interaction might not always attract the biggest research funding. And as academics, the pressure is on us to get research funding, and whether or not the corporatization of universities is going to encourage those engagements with communities, I think might be a piece of work that's needed. That's going a little bit off topic there, but I think there is an issue there around how universities are fundamentally funded and operate, because it is more about a dollar value rather than in the past there was that opportunity for the engagement with the communities. Just a comment.
Does anyone else want to add to that?
Only to say that I know that this has been an ongoing conversation at the university, not related to energy at all, but at the universities in general, about how research is funded and getting more visibility on the true cost of research, and understanding that universities are needing to somewhat cross-subsidize the research efforts through other means. And if that could be addressed, that might make a huge difference.
Mm. And I guess from my perspective, having been at CSIRO and then in the universities, it also, and working closely with communities to document and then share and those sort of case studies, I think there are great roles to do that. And as universities look towards more impact and translation of research, I think it behooves us to be doing that and working. And so, for example, if I got an email through our institute to say, we've got all these wind developers knocking on our door, but we don't know anything much about wind, and this will get to a question that Peter Hansford's got. And so it was from a farmer. So basically what we did there was said, okay, well, let's get the Shire Council involved, and we pulled together a key group of stakeholders. Now, that's really, there was no funds involved in that. It was a service and an engagement activity to actually share. So we brought some, science of renewable energy. We brought the government, Western Power, Synergy, all of those players. So bringing, I think, the industry and everyone together to have those was really important. And I guess, I mean, it is challenging if we think about, I'm completely frustrated that the social science and just and fair transition work has been done. If you think right back to nuclear in the 60s, Barrow, Fishoff, Ortman Wren and Webler had done all of this work. So it's been done, but the translation is really important. And I think, and we're looking at sort of developing that going forward as well, to think about how do we do that more systematically. So I'm just going to go to Peter's, sorry, because I was rambling, which I shouldn't be doing as moderator or chair. Communities have in the past provided social license to developers of RE projects on the promise of economic opportunities and support for community groups. Notwithstanding these past efforts, there is now growing resistance to onshore and offshore energy infrastructure. How do we share the benefits of this economic transformation? And does community ownership offer a way forward? Any thoughts on benefit sharing?
And Peter, you're going to be the expert on this topic, but I might kick off with a sentiment that has stuck with me since I heard it at a CSIRO event last year in Brisbane, which was from Julia Spicer, who's Queensland's chief entrepreneur, and she had said at the time, if you've been to one regional community, you've been to one regional community. And so I think that level of engagement, the social license, I expect will be different, or will look different in different places.
Frank, from an economics perspective.
Yeah, thanks. Just want to share the obvious observation, which, by the way, has been substantiated in academic research time and time again, is that, much of the concern about public infrastructure that adversely affects landholders or local residents, right? And we're thinking transmission lines could be wind turbines, could be highways, could be anything else. That public concern can often be alleviated through benefit sharing, right? And so, it seems from an economic perspective very, very obvious, right, that to the extent that you're imposing negative externalities on local landholders, people who are in the line of view of new assets, right? You want to compensate them, right? We're talking about very, very large project costs here, and typically a very small percentage of project costs allocated to local people who might face adverse effects goes a long way in making everyone happy, right? It's really not that hard. It is, in fact, in the end, a question for regulation as much as anything else, right? Because it's not inherently in the interest of the project proponent to be generous with compensation to local communities and individuals, right? Because if there's other ways of getting it through, then they'll choose that, not to inflate the cost base of the project. And so sort of a more standardized regulatory approach to providing compensation might well be the way to go.
And I think we've seen that with the transmission lines. There's sort of quite a normalisation of the benefits, which was slow to come in the start because there were different levels, and between different states you saw the ways that people, and of course someone's got a cousin that is a farm in the other state that's going to pick up the phone and talk about this stuff. So the transparency again is really key. It's tricky when developers are trying to sign non-disclosure agreements and then that they can't share that with the neighbours, and how do we talk about all of these sorts of things. But also I think the other thing when it comes to benefits, it's not always just financial, or it might be in a structure or something that's important to that community. So Dani, your point, if you've been to one regional community, only that one, what's important in one town will be quite different to another, and we just can't, it's not a one size fits all. And I think that that's where actually it behooves the industry and, you know, to really start to sort of work very closely with those to understand what that is. I think the other challenge when it comes to wind now, though, which I've sort of been engaging with some of the literature, is as they become larger structures and the price of renewable energy, you know, comes down, the electricity that and so forth, it's actually the margins, you know, that would normally have been paid is different. So therefore that's challenging projects over time as well. It's not to say that's not, but I know that that's part of the consideration when we're thinking about how communities are compensated. When it comes to ownership, I think it's a really interesting question, and obviously we're looking at that. First Nations are looking at equity ownership and all sorts of sides there. Does anyone have any thoughts of community ownership of renewable energy projects, perhaps? No. I think there are examples where it has been done, and small scale and so forth. And I think it also depends, again, on people's levels of interest in being part of that. There are some communities that are working, and I guess if we think about our distributed energy or resources of rooftop, there's a lot of people that are, you know, deploying their own renewable generation sources. And then I think everyone's thinking about how we harness that better so that everyone can participate more. And that's, I gets back to your regulation point, I think, as well, Frank, around how that can be done. And it's even interesting, you know, listening to seeing what's happening in WA and our market structure as opposed to the East, and how there's a few different tweaks that actually change how people actually can participate in different levels as a result of that. Look, I think that's probably just about time, but I might just ask you, if you know, magic wand, if you could change one thing to accelerate the energy transition, what would that be? And I'll just go in the order of speaking. So Dani, what would the one thing that you might change?
Oh, that is a difficult one to just to think. There are so many things, and I feel like the conference put forward so many different options. But if I had one thing, and it's probably impossible, but it would be for us to be able to, going back to my first comment, focus on the shared benefits or the shared interest, and being able to move through some of the divergence of particularly political opinion in this space, and talk more about how we can get there in a really productive way. I'm not, I thought we were there, maybe we're not quite there yet.
Thanks. Frank, from your perspective.
Sorry, I've had too much airtime here.
What would be the one thing, if you were going, you know, that we need to focus on to accelerate the energy transition?
Well, investment, right? But what is it that makes the investment flow, right? And that really it's providing solid expectations of future gain to investors, right? So reducing uncertainty about future policy, market and regulatory settings, and creating the preconditions for green electricity, green energy, and green energy intensive products to really earn a premium in markets, right? That's really at the bottom of it, right? And there's a very important role for governments in this, obviously, in getting the settings right. And very fundamentally, as we've been grappling with in this country for maybe 2 decades or so, the political footy match over this is really quite unhelpful to investors, right? And so, but that, and that's, of course, part of that is playing out this morning with that media conference probably just ended or whatever. That's ultimately something that's quite beyond the grasp of research, and that's for that broader conversation in society of about where Australia's benefit lies in that huge transition that is going on globally, right? And somehow this country needs to land on some broadly shared understanding right through society as to where we ought to be heading. And for that understanding then to translate into some sort of political truth. So that's ultimately what's needed. And I guess as universities, we can contribute to that to some extent, but we shouldn't understand that to be the burden that we have to carry.
Thanks, Frank. Paul?
Yeah, it's not easy to give one. I think from my perspective, probably the regulations is the one that I think needs to be tightened up or resolved one way or the other, because I think until we've got a better handle on the regulations part, investors are not going to have the confidence. And if we don't have the investors, then we're going to be relying on subsidies, and that's just not a sustainable solution. So I think from pragmatic answer to your question, that would be what I would suggest, Peter, would be the regulations front. But that's not in any way discounting any of the other aspects, and in particular funding from some way, shape or form. The technologies need advancement, the social license needs advancement. There's all these other aspects that need to be addressed as well. So I don't think I want to pick one, but if I did, it would have to be regulations.
Yeah, it's a good point. I always think of Penelope Crosley saying, I wouldn't want to be living near a Bunnings right now, because, you know, if they're selling batteries, there's no regulation in place for the safe management of it. That was just a real takeaway. I think also, Frank, you're spot on with the politics. It's really challenging. I guess, you know, just talking really frankly as an energy researcher who is concerned about climate, you know, when I thought about the budget announcement and the next day, the sort of, any investment that we'd give to the billionaires, the critical minerals and the hydrogen, I mean, that just sends we know those things are important, and sort of to counteract that. So multinationals who are wanting the certainty respond to that quite negatively. And I remember when, similarly, when Dan Andrews said we're not doing the Commonwealth Games, there were people that I know working in wind going, this sends a real, internationally sends a really bad signal that we're a good place to do business with, because if government can turn on a dime, then that certainty is, the rug is pulled out. And so we somehow, and I guess, if I think about people that I've worked with, both in government and in industry, everyone was pretty much celebrating the fact that these emissions targets are, being put through, and, we're actually got a direction forward, and we can be very proud, Australians, that we're contributing to the sort of action on climate, and we're a perfect place to do it as an island country. We can test innovation, and we can also share that, because we haven't even talked about the developing countries and the ASEAN on our doorstep who really need help as well. If we can find out ways that we can innovate and so forth. So I think, I would go back to that we need to really document and engage and work with Australian public. For those that want to, not everyone does. We've got to respect those that just want to get on, put food on the table and all those things in these hardship times. But I think there is an opportunity to really try and lift the level of discussion and understanding and a little bit of the debate, but to do it in a safe, protected way so that people can express their views, can have their views answered, so that then they actually sort of can go forth and participate, and perhaps be a little bit more discerning when we see what's playing out through the media, because the media is always going to take a position, because that's what's going to sell the next e-news and those sorts of things. So I think there is a real role for us to bring the science, and then also, if we think about the contestation that, some of the communities from a social science perspective, really getting to the heart of what's causing that, and then trying to learn and share and the different ways. So I think our whole science methods of experimentation and reflection is a really critical part that we should keep going for. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you fellow panelists, and also for the committee that helped get the last, conference off. It's always challenging. And Dani, we look forward to, news of the next one and where things are going to go. So let's watch this space, and look forward to sort of burning the flag to keep moving this forward. Thanks, everybody.